Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. Not necessarily in that order, I like to say. And we are delighted to be spending the hour with Mr. John Strasberg, who is the son of the great acting teacher Lee Strasberg, one of the great acting teachers of the 20th century, creator of the method. And John has gone, he grew up with all that background, all that theater, all of that magic that Lee Strasberg represented, being the teacher of Marilyn Monroe, of Al Pacino, and all that intellectual ferment. And he soaked all that up, and then he went off on his own way, in his own path, and he created his own kind of organic type of teaching method that's very spontaneous, that, he's a very wise person, and we're so happy that we have him here and to be in a dialogue with him and learning about his insights into not just acting but creativity in general. This studio that we're in on 38th Street and 8th Avenue is kind of a research center. It feels more of we're in an educational space here. And so let's talk about growing up with Lee Strasberg as a dad. And, there's a term in psychology, we talk about individuating. When you individuate, you sort of create your own uniqueness, your own self, and you separate from the family and from that. And how did you get sort of a start with your dad, but then you broke away on your own? It's a very complicated, it probably would take a whole show just to talk about that, but maybe we could start with that.
Well, I think that's pretty much a normal life process to some degrees. I don't think that my suffering is unusual. It's unusual only in the sense that I come from a famous family, but I think anyone goes through that to some extent, especially if you have parents who are very successful. Even if it's business and things like that, and you go for your own identity. And I would have done anything to end up in a different profession. I did, I hated the theater when I was a kid because I thought my parents preferred it to me. And so that when I did end up in it, part of it was like I couldn't think of anything else that I wanted to do. I had grown up thinking that I was going to be a doctor, and I think I still am sometimes, but in a certain way. I had these ideas about what I thought I might want to do, and that all just blew up in mid-adolescence. I think some people in adolescence are happy, and some are miserable. I was the miserable. I don't think I've ever been more miserable than I was when I was 17. And certainly with my father, the relationship was complex in the sense that he was not very warm, and therefore, I sometimes still have to remind myself that he loved me. So if which I don't think I'm alone in that. And sometimes when you love someone, but in a way you don't have the feeling that they receive your love, then you don't know quite what to do. And so I suffered a lot with that. And certainly when I then started to work in the same profession, I didn't have the problem just with him. My mother I loved my mother, and I knew that my mother loved me. There was an effective relationship, which had lots of feeling in it. But my mother, I think, was probably one of the greatest natural producers in the history of anything, who, if she had not submitted herself to making my father and the family famous, could have been a great, well-known producer in her own right. but what it meant was that she meddled in everybody's life.
Okay.
and so she would say, "Well, Johnny, you should," and I would go, "Leave me alone. I'll do it myself." And some of that I'm proud of. Some of that I say, anything that I got myself. And I had to do that. I had to know that what I was doing was not something that was because I was Lee Strasberg's son, or Susan Strasberg's brother. And that was, for me, a problem for many, many years. Now it's not. Now it's a privilege, now being part of the family. Well, actually, they're all in me now, because they're all dead. And I represent the immediate family, and it's something that I'm very proud of. But that's after having gone through all the years of living for myself, which at certain moments meant that I had to remove myself from the family. I went away. I went to Canada. I went to a variety of places, in order for me to evolve and develop myself. And of course, growing up around all these successful people, I didn't want to be like any of them, because I thought that most of them were not happy and had deep insatisfaction in their life. Wow. And I didn't want to be like that. And I had a big problem for many, many years, because most of the people I knew who were extremely successful were extremely neurotic. And I thought that part of being successful, you had to be, can I say fucked up? No, I can't. Okay, we'll bleep it out. Right. Had to be bleep.
This is including your dad?
Yeah.
In terms of neurotic, or?
Well, I'll tell you a story about my father. I love the ocean, and one of my greatest pleasures is to be able to just float in the ocean like a cork and, swim. And, it's a healing experience for me. And I remember one day, because we spent summers on Fire Island, my sister, who became a star at a very young,
Susan,
yeah, at a very young age. She created the role of Anne Frank. She
was in Picnic.
She was in Picnic.
The movie. Yeah.
She was on the first. She was in a play with Richard Burton and Helen Hayes called Time Remembered, in which they were all laughing because the price was $9.90 a ticket, which was exorbitant in those days. Imagine. So they were saying, God, yes, $3.30 a star. Now it would be $330 a star.
Right.
It's just gotten insane. But and she bought the house on Fire Island and signed it over to my father, but we spent a lot of summers out there. And I said, how come? And he loved the ocean. I said, how come you don't go in? And he looked at me and and he said, I thought about it. And one day, he says, I went down to the ocean, and I was standing there, and, and the ocean was looking at me, and I was looking at the ocean, and it came in, and I thought about it, and I decided I didn't want to get involved. Which is a great story.
How old were you in this conversation?
Oh, I was probably 17, 18,
okay.
19, something like that,
And that's illustrative of something.
Well, I think it goes deeper. Yeah, I think there's a deeper sense in which he lived in his own world. He was I would think, I don't think of myself as an intellectual. I think I'm intelligent. But I don't think of myself as living an intellectual life. I live in a physical world. I like sports. I was been active in sports most of my life. Certainly I read and I can write. I just want to make it clear. I read and write, and I can spell. Actually, Susan taught me how to spell. And she was a lousy speller, and I'm a great speller. So I have this idea that when she was teaching me when we were kids, she gave me her spelling and didn't have any left for her.
That was very generous of her, of Susan.
Yeah. Well, no, I think we used to hang upside down on under our, so that we were looking under our beds at one another. Yes. And I think that something fell out of her head, and I must have breathed it in.
That's beautiful. That's wow.
Anyway.
Wow. So this is a wonderful beginning to our dialogue here, and there's some things I wanted to share with you because I also have a very complicated and complex relationship with acting and the world of theater, which began when my grandmother was brought to America at the age of 7, when she was basically almost practically adopted by a famous actress named Blanche Walsh, who befriended my grandmother's mother working as a chambermaid in a hotel in London. My grandmother never knew her dad. Her dad took off when she was born, and so she was being raised by her single mother, who was a chambermaid of a hotel in London, where Blanche Walsh, who was big time on Broadway, she was a very, very serious actress. She was considered like the American Sarah Bernhardt in that league, befriended my grandmother's mother, said, "How would you like to come to New York and be my wardrobe lady, my head wardrobe lady?" She said, "Yeah, let's go." And they were unpacking the trunk in New York, and a picture fell out of a little girl. And this famous actress said, "Who's that child?" And my grandmother's mother started crying. And she said, "That's my daughter. I didn't think I could bring her." And so this actress said, and this was on the stage of her real life, not the Broadway stage. She said, "We can't leave your daughter behind. We'll send for her right away. That's your look at that lovely child. We can't leave her behind." And my grandmother came over first class on the American Starliner. There was a limousine waiting to whisk her from the Hudson River dock to Blanche Walsh's Park Avenue duplex. And my grandmother said to me, "John, this actress was more of a mother to me than my own mother in many ways." So that was my grandmother coming in. Blanche Walsh died young at 42. But one of the things Blanche Walsh wanted to do was to create what she called a national liberal theater of America. She felt America needed a national theater like London, like England had a national theater. And she envisioned this chain of theaters nationwide that would be also a space of education, that would give lectures, and that would have serious drama at a low cost, and where there would also be a magazine connected to it that artists could publish, and critics and could write about theater and all kinds of art. And she had this idea, which she actually got from Mark Twain. And she said to Mark Twain, she corresponded with Mark Twain, and she said, "Well, why don't you help me with this?" And he said, "No, I like to scatter the seeds around and let other people do the work." So she was. There was an article in the Brooklyn Eagle from 1899, a full-page article about this obsession that Blanche Walsh had for a national liberal theater of America. She was the primary advocate of it. It never came to pass because she died in 1915. But later on, you had things like the Theater Guild and the laboratory theater in the 20s, which then paved the way for the group theater, which paved the way for the Actors Studio. So all those experiments sort of came later. But here was a woman who was like a maternal influence on my grandmother. And that sort of came into me. My grandmother never went into acting, or she wanted to be a singer. She never realized that dream, but she used to sing to me and as a child. So all of that. And then my father, as a young man, picked up the acting gene, and he was an actor in his early 20s. He was in a play with Warren Beatty. He was in the play where Beatty was discovered for Hollywood by Joshua Logan, a play called Compulsion. One of two plays that Beatty was in. My dad was in that play. My dad did not get discovered. Beatty got discovered. And so then my dad became a projectionist and working backstage. He worked at the Playhouse on the Mall, which was the first theater in America located in a shopping mall. And it was founded by a guy named Robert Ludlum, who was later became an author of spy novels, but was involved. Remember Robert Ludlum? He was the impresario of this theater in a shopping mall that my dad was acting as a young man. Then he got married. He gave up the acting dream, and yet later in his life he became an activist. and he came out as an activist on the stage of council meetings in the town of Edgewater, fighting the powers that be, who wanted to put condos behind our house where the Palisades were, the beautiful green Palisades. They were going to tear up the woods, these rapacious realtors, real estate developers, and my dad stopped them in their tracks by going to council meetings and articulating as an actor in his own life. So for me, and this is why meeting you was such a revelation, I just finished writing a book called A New Theory of Fame. I think fame needs to be reimagined and reconceptualized. I think a lot of the wrong people are famous today, and we need to, and I think there's a connection between acting and activism. That if you could find your voice on a stage, you could find your voice in the community, and it's more important to be, and this is the title of my one-man show that I'm writing. This is my first play. I've ever attempted to write a play about my life, which is going to be a one-man show, and the title is How to Be an Actor in Your Own Life. And as all this was going on, I meet you, and you seem to be an advocate of this process that the real magic happens in life. Does that make any sense? I'm sorry if I talked a lot, but...
There's several things there.
Yeah.
First of all, I think the most political play ever written is Romeo and Juliet, because I believe that if people really believed that love was the most important thing in life, we would change the world. And certainly a national theater is still a dream. I think the only chance that we have had, a real chance, was the Actors Studio. The Actors Studio had a body of famous actors. It had a body of knowledge.
Who were they? Maybe we could just mention to remind people.
Who weren't they?
Who weren't they?
You start with Brando and James Dean,
Pacino, Al Pacino,
Jerry Page, Kim Stanley. It's an endless. It's a relatively endless list, But of course, there is not the spirit to do that in the country, and it's one of the few countries that I think what I love about the United States. I think it has more freedom than any place I've ever been. It has a lot of things wrong with it, but we have more. We don't know how privileged we are, and that is palpable to me. But we also have a lot of Americans, and particularly politicians, who believe that freedom is their right to defend their ignorance to the death. And therefore, it is one of the few countries in the world in which politicians are proud of their ignorance. They're proud not to be cultural. They're proud not to like theater, not to be interested in that. Even in other countries, they may not like it, but you can't say that you don't like it. You have to at least pretend that you are artistically conscious, and that's not true here. That doesn't exist. So there is obviously no central way in which to make that kind of thing happen. I don't know whether that will ever get fixed or whatever. It is what it is. And you take the good with the bad. We'll see, I guess. Well, maybe we won't see. We probably will not be alive, to find out. I think one of the big mistakes that we made in the country is when we moved the capital from New York to Washington. I think that most countries, the political capital is also the cultural capital, and that's not true here. London, is the capital; it's the cultural capital. Paris, has both, and New York certainly is the cultural capital, and in some ways the economic capital, but it is not the political capital, and I think that's a mistake. I think that's part of the reason. Of course, they did it because the first presidents were all from Virginia, so they didn't want to travel to New York. So they built it in a marsh. in the swamps, and still is in the swamps.
Oh, yes. Well, if you look at it now, well, we could mention Donald Trump. It seems like it's a very theatrical, almost has a circus-like, carnivalesque quality to it. But let's not let Trump take over our interview, though, or he's taken over everything else. He's not going to take over this interview. Donald?
Whatever you think about him, you at least have the thing that's more frightening is when people want to vote for him.
Okay, there you go. There you go. I want to go to some of your work here, John, and let's see here. I did take some notes, and you say about this idea of the role of obsession in creativity, that obsession is actually a good thing. Here's a quote from your website. You say, "How do you know when you're developing a good creative process? The answer is when you begin to develop the kind of contact with yourself and the context of the play, and you discover you have a question about a specific reality that obsesses you. And when you have a particular problem that you become obsessed about and need to resolve, you have to learn how to handle the natural desire to be obsessed about your work. Obsession is normal to any creative process. Scientists like Einstein, dancers like Nijinsky, composers, writers, businessmen like Rockefeller, leaders like Caesar, doctors, and yes, actors, passionate about what they do, become obsessed. You have to learn to be the boss of the process, not letting fear or your emotions run you aground. If they do, they are useless to you." One of the things I talk about in my teaching practice and that I talk about on this show, and I've begun to give lectures about this, is the idea that people can go for their dreams, and they often don't go for their dreams because of various reasons, because of they're overworked, they're apathetic, they don't have confidence in themselves. People who could be writers or actors or whatever it is they really want to do, and that fear that holds them back. And I think, is that something you're also trying to get at also? Or?
You have to. I define professional as, I think that amateurs work on their fear and professionals work on what they're afraid they might not be able to do. And fear is a very powerful emotion. One has to learn to use it. I've studied martial arts, and most martial arts, for instance, in the katas, the forms that you learn, all begin with a defense, meaning that you're attacked, you're afraid, and you react. And this is, I don't think, coincidental. I think there's an awareness. Fear is a very important emotion. It's how one survives. The problem is most people are afraid of life. And this is a very deep, very serious problem. In other words, that their fear, if you define life scientifically, according to people that I have spoken to, life is spontaneous. You look in a microscope, it's moving. When it stops moving, it's dead. And therefore this spontaneity of movement defines it. And in order to do that, one has to confront a lot of one's fears, about just being spontaneous and doing these things. The word obsession, I've talked to a lot of doctors, and, a lot of them don't like using the word in a positive sense. They say that it has a negative, it's excessive focus. It becomes compulsive focus. So I'm in between asking, well, is it and I've tried to look in the dictionary to see, if how the word is actually defined, because I certainly have used it in a positive sense, and I'm trying to find other words that I, like preoccupied, like it's, well, preoccupied is not a bad word, where one one becomes consumed by something. It has the same sense, and it is part of any creative process. That one cannot stop thinking about it. You have, if anything, you have to try to find moments in which you say, I need to leave this alone. It's exhausting me, things like that. And one has to learn how to handle that to a certain extent. But it is totally normal. It exists in all creative processes. There is such a deep passion that one, children have it naturally. Children's ability to focus when there's something they're interested in. Yes. This is not something that one learns. Right. It's actually something that one has forgotten or been conditioned to ignore. And you almost have to, in many ways, some of my work, once I went away from the idea that you were teaching people a series of techniques, which is fundamentally what my father was doing. He was a great teacher. Yes. And he was basing his training on someone knowing enough about themselves to be able to use their memories. And I was trained that way. And it's very powerful. And it does work. You can create life. My problem was that it always felt as though I was manipulating myself. And I wanted not just to create a parallel world, I wanted to actually immerse myself in the character's world. And that feeling, which happened to me when I was inspired, and there was no separation between me and the character, is what fundamentally, if I can't say obsessed, consumed me. And as I became more and more myself, my work evolved, and I went away. I still teach sense memory, because I think it's a powerful technique, but it is not the technique. And I think that when you're actually training somebody, the most important thing, what defines all technique, is imagination. You have to find out how much imagination the person has and whether or not they can focus their imagination on some specific reality. Einstein knew that because he said imagination is more important than knowledge, because with imagination you change reality. And this is true. In a creative process, that's absolutely what is happening. It happens to a businessman. He has a problem, you think about it, and you come up with a solution which is sometimes surprising because you have an inventive way, and this comes from your ability to use your imagination. And if someone has a lot of imagination, the technique they're going to need to have will be different from someone who has less imagination and has to find ways either to stimulate their imagination or focus it. And there are also people who have a lot of imagination and can't focus it, and therefore it's not useful to them. But all of that is then an analysis of the human being that you're dealing with, so that your technique or what you're going to teach them depends on who they are. You can't give somebody talent. You can't give someone humanity. You have to find out what they have and what they can access in themselves. A lot of people, the older I get, when I was raised, my parents raised me with the idea that talent will always be discovered, that it will find a way to be discovered. I find that an extremely romantic idea, and it's not true. And the older I get, the more I ask, how many people were never discovered? How many people never discovered their own talent? How many people had their talent crushed by someone either deliberately cruel or who didn't recognize who they were? I even think that there are probably great works of art that are out there that are not in museums. I don't believe that we've found it all and that we know what the history of the world is.
Wow. Well, I launched myself on a lecture tour this year. Since nobody invited me to speak, I said, I have things to say, and I figured out a way to get myself on a lecture tour. And I spoke at 7 different places in the New York City area, because if you're going to go on tour, this is the city, right, to do that. And I didn't have a name for my tour. Actually, the tour began in Greenwich Village at an open mic at a church St. John's Church on Christopher Street. It's called the Village Coffee House open mic, and you get 10 minutes. Mostly there are singers and a few poets, and I just got up for 10 minutes and talked and didn't know what I was going to say, but just said, I'm going to just say whatever comes into my mind as I launch myself onto this lecture tour, and it's going to evolve into something. And it did. It evolved and it grew. And through conversation and speaking, which is also linguistics, Chomsky did some work on this where he shows that speaking and conversation and language production itself is very highly creative. You never know what you're going to say until you say it, and the same for writing. So I was sort of tapping into that, and then all of a sudden I was on a tour, and I spoke at Blue Stockings bookstore in the Lower East Side. I gave it more of a political talk there. I spoke at Bariqua College up in Washington Heights, and one of the talks I gave was in Harlem at the only black-owned bookstore in New York. It's called Sisters Uptown Bookstore and Culture Center. And it's actually in a building where Harry Belafonte once lived, in this building, right? So I felt like I had the spirit of Belafonte with me, and I was there on this stage. At first, nobody showed up. It was supposed to start at 6 o'clock, and then we're waiting, and then a few people trickled in, and one of my colleagues from the college where I was teaching, I put flyers up. She happened to see the flyer, and she came, and then a few people from the neighborhood came, and we had a small group there, and the title of that talk was How to Dream Big, Stay Strong, and Be Happy in an Age of Downsized Expectations. How to Dream Big, Stay Strong, and Be Happy in an Age of Downsized Expectations. And so I think the work you're doing is similar to that in terms of keeping people strong in their own lives. And what's important in our work in this show and my work in education is how we learn and grow from our encounters with literature, cinema, theater. In other words, the interaction between the audience member and what we get from that. It's kind of a conversation also. It's like you get something from the play, and then you can also talk to other people about it and get the meaning from it. But are there works of art that are being produced today in theater and in movies that are transforming people's lives? Because that goes back. I finally gave my lecture tour a name, and I called it the Creative Transformations Victory Tour. Creative Transformations Victory Tour. And you like that word transformation. You use that a lot. And then 2 weeks after I gave my tour that name, Donald Trump got up and announced his candidacy and said there are no more victories in America. Well, I beg to differ, Donald, because I had a Creative Transformations Victory Tour in New York this year that I essentially am still on. But so talk about transformation. Talk about how works of art can change us, and what maybe works of art that you have encountered in your life that have been transformative for you as a person.
Well,
movies.
First of all, I think that, for instance, when I was young, my father would talk about theater as being heightened reality. Then you have Harold Clurman, who talked about lies like truth, which comes from Shakespeare. And I never understood what they were talking about, because, I understood, but it seemed to me as though, are you implying that when someone is acting, it's a lie? I said, if that's the case, then all art is a lie. And I don't believe that. I think that art is transformational. An artist, a painter, looks at the life around him, and that is transformed into something that he paints, whether it is a realistic painting, abstract painting. It is all an expression of the life experience of the artist. And that when we then participate, we go and see the artwork or read the artwork, we are also transformed, because the artist shares a perception of reality that they have, and that makes us think about our own lives, and then sometimes that leads us to go through our own transformational processes. And it is an essential part of the thing about the lack of respect for art is that when we think about great cultures, they are not defined by their conquest, they're defined by their artworks. You know, and the history books are full of all the wrong things and all the wrong people. You know, because there's a lot of things that are in history books that have never changed anything. They've just destroyed something or won something, but they don't really change anything.
Wow.
You know, and if somebody wrote a book about what works or what actions of human endeavor really caused a change, you know, it would be a different kind of history. We would be talking about something else. You know,
Well, Howard Zinn wrote The People's History of the United States, which is a history from the standpoint of the victims of imperialism, of poor people, of black people, of native people, of indigenous people. So that's another example.
Well, it's a perspective.
Yeah.
You know, it's a, you know, everybody is going to. The thing about truth is, if you change your perspective, you'll see a different truth. You know, you know, or you see the same reality from a different point of view. This is the world that we live in now. Even scientists, they no longer talk in absolutes. And the scientist is a part of the equation. The observer affects the equation.
Is that the Heisenberg principle?
Yeah, this is all the stuff in physics.
Right.
Which has revolutionized the world. It's
Claudia's background is biology.
Yeah, it's not a. We're not living in a two-dimensional world, and yet a lot of people still think in a linear way. And actually, it's not. The world is no longer linear. It's not 2 points. It's not that definitive. It's more. It's moving all the time. You know, which is very beautiful. But you know, okay. So now what? What shall I be doing? You know, and I don't know, works that. For a long time, I had tremendous difficulty with modern art, painting. I didn't get it. Sometimes I could look at something and I could like it. And I still think that that's important. It has to speak to you in some way or other. But it's kind of like speaking to you. I mean, I've lived in Europe, and so I love to eat well. And I've eat cheeses that most Americans would look at and go, "Oh my God, it's got green on it." You know, how can you? You know, it's like dangerous. You know? Or, "Oh my God, the smell." It's like, you know, say, "Yeah, isn't it good?" You know, "Oh, and it's almost looks like it's melting," and I go, "Yeah, isn't that great?" You know?
Oh my God.
You know, so these are all. Sometimes you need to be educated in things, or you don't. You know, you don't know actually what you're either looking at or unappreciating. And I'm talking about that because I went one day. I was doing a play in Barcelona, and I had a day off, and I went to the Picasso Museum, which was a house in which they had, and you walked through the house from room to room, and it traced the evolution of his work, and I got it. I understood what was happening in the way in which he both saw the world and expressed it. And he, for instance, in particular, he said, "I don't paint what I see, I paint what I think." You know, and I was like, "Oh, wow." And that just opened my mind up to what modern art was, for instance. You know, and there's a story about Kandinsky, who's asleep in his atelier, and he has a dream. And in the dream, he sees the most beautiful painting that he has ever seen in his life. And he realized that he wasn't dreaming. He was looking at his own painting, which was upside down on the easel. And that is the beginning of the surrealist painting. It's an accident.
You say something about dreams.
You know?
An accident. And that's going to bring to another aspect of your work where you say things happen more naturally or accidentally on purpose, which is the title of your book, which was also made into a documentary film. But when you said about dreams, this is another quote from your website that I would love to have your reaction to. You say, "Your thoughts become more personal and real and help to involve you deeply in the imaginary world that you are focusing on and want to make real. As your process develops, your sense of direction, your choices of what to focus and concentrate on, go to the heart of whatever context you are working on and help you to become deeply involved in the world you are dreaming about. All this takes place in what I call your personal dream space. I love that phrase. Where you dream about your work, yourself, the context of the character in the play while you are awake. In a way, technique in the organic creative process teaches you to dream on your feet. It is and isn't otherworldly. So this idea of dreams, and which also Carl Jung had a lot to say about as a psychotherapist, I find that your manner is very calm and healing and soothing and almost a therapeutic. It's all an illusion. Okay. Because you grew.
Inside, I am a prune. It's like.
Okay. But you grew up in a kind of a more, like you said, high-strung type of atmosphere where your dad was known to be stoic and known to not express a lot.
He lived in his own world. He was like a child. He lived in his own world.
But he kind of had a guru-like aspect. Do you develop that?
I won't. No,
Okay.
no, I won't do that. No.
Okay.
If I wanted to be a guru, it would have been easy to do, and I would probably be making a lot more money than I'm making. Because yes, you can manipulate people, you can do all these things, but I like having a private life, and I want people. I think part of what you teach people is that if they dream about something, they have to take responsibility for their dreams. No one is going to give it to them, and life is hard, and you have to know how to stay focused and just keep going. If somebody. Somebody gave me this cup, exert your will.
Very Nietzschean, very Nietzschean.
People, people underestimate willpower.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, most of us think that willpower is to do all the things we don't want to do, and nobody talks about needing willpower to do what you do want to do. Willpower used in a positive way, because that's the only way you get through difficult moments.
Yes.
When you're having trouble. You have to be, and
yes.
It doesn't feel good, and you're not having a good time, and you may feel that you're failing at something, and either you give up or you take a deep breath and you keep going. And this is a matter of will. And if someone doesn't learn that, that's something that you have to. Schools, for instance, and I know too many people who don't have that, and they never learned young about sticking to it, finishing what you start. They never learned, so they gave up.
Right.
And you give up if you give up once, it's one thing. You give up twice, and by the time you're giving up the third time, you may as well just die.
Wow. One of the things I read, this book really, the book that led me to you, John, is a book by Foster Hirsch, who's a film historian, and he was a guest on our show, and he wrote this wonderful book about the method acting, and he has a whole chapter on your dad. It's been said that this book was the very first in-depth treatment of Lee Strasberg, an analysis. It was published in 1984. It was called The Method to Their Madness. Right, and but one of the things I learned from that book, that the group theater, which was the predecessor of the Actors Studio, didn't really take off until its fifth year. It was 5 years into it when they came out with Waiting for Lefty, which was by Clifford Odets, and they said that was the birth of the 1930s because it was a very radical lefty play about socialism.
It was in the Depression.
And it was in the depths of the Depression, so that.
I didn't like the play.
He didn't like that?
No. Clifford, I grew up. Clifford was my sister's godfather, and he used to bring me stamps all the time, and he was part of the family, and so when I found out that originally Clifford had been an actor, and when he started to write, he was very politely told by Harold and my father and Cheryl that they were not interested.
Oh my God!
And the
he was rejected.
Yes.
By your dad.
And the members said, we want to do this play, and they went off and did it, despite the leadership. You know, that's the real story.
Now they just did a remounting. Yeah.
So I went so later. How come my father and Clifford became that close? My father directed several of his plays. You know, and I went, well, I don't know what happened. Maybe Clifford got successful, so all of a sudden they became friends. You know, I don't. You know,
well,
whatever.
There was a tension with your dad.
One another. You know, certainly.
I don't want to talk too much about your dad because this is about you, but it was interesting. The thing I learned about your dad was that from this book by Foster Hirsch, that in the beginning, you know, he was totally not about fame. Your father, they were idealistic people. They were all about the act and the craft of the work, and that was what was real. But something happened with your father that he began to get some stars in his eyes, that people like Marilyn Monroe came into the actor's studio and they said, what is she doing here? Some of the people said that. And he thought she had talent and he saw something in her. But for a lot of the diehard avant-gardists, you know, they said he's betraying the principles of what we're all about. And then a lot of the actors who really were all about the craft and not about fame began to resent your father because they said he was spending more time with the famous ones. Is that what happened?
Yeah. Did it happen like that? Well, it's hard to just skim over it, you know. But certainly, I do think that when the Actors Studio Theater was formed, that there was a tendency to try to cast it with famous people, you know, and I don't think his attraction to Marilyn was based on her fame. I think it was based on the type of person that she was. I think he loved wounded people. And certainly she was an extremely wounded person. And he does say that in his lifetime he met two people who had unusual talent. One was Marlon Brando, and the other is Marilyn Monroe. Now, you either have to say that he was nuts, you know, or just bowled over by blondes, you know, or that he saw something. And here I have. It's in my book. I'm dealing with this in the book because when Marilyn came into our family, the family was never the same, and the family was changed, and she became like a fifth member of the family, you know, and you know, so that you could say that we were Marilyn's family. I mean, it wasn't just a thing of the business; it became the family.
Was that a cool thing, or did you get a little jealous? Or
I wasn't jealous. Okay, no, I'm a guy. You know,
right.
I'm not going to be jealous of Marilyn Monroe. You know, but
right.
Unfortunately for my sister suffered enormously.
Oh.
My sister, when Marilyn came around, it was 1954.
Yeah.
You know, my sister was 16. She had done Picnic. She was going into Diary of Anne Frank, and she got ignored.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
you know,
sad.
and
That's
that
sad.
was awful. I don't think she ever recovered. You know, because it was like, what do I have to do to get your love now?
Oh,
You know,
yes.
and so I find that, you know, I write about a lot of this is in a book which hopefully will be published next year.
Oh.
You know, I just gave it to my publisher. It's been through several drafts, and
Wow.
in which I talk about this not so much to,
Yeah.
you know, the book started out as it was my way of mourning Susan after she died.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to write a book about her spirit, so it was, you know, she was floating around in outer space, and you know. And she met my family, you know, and it was an otherworldly book. It was, I loved it. But I realized that if I was going to write a book about, you know, like if Harry Potter was a real person, you have to say what really happened. And I didn't want to do that. And then Susan kept haunting me because there were things that she wanted done in her lifetime. And so the book went through many, many evolutions. and is finally, I hope it's out. I hope it's out and out of the house and finished so I can go on to something else. But
I just work with this. I was at the Strand bookstore one day and I saw a book it was a novel written about Marilyn, that she had a little dog, and Lee Strasberg was in that book too. Do you know about this book? It's a novel. I forgot the title, I forgot the author, but it was...
I've read it. I did a lot of research on it, and most of the books I read about people who never knew her, who have, and it's all about who they know she was. I just think they're all nuts,
Oh my gosh. Oh.
But anyways, you have to read my book. I don't want to go into it too much.
No, don't give away the secrets. Read
really
the... Okay.
I have things to say.
Well, there's so much to say. I hope this goes on. I hope this is only the beginning with our dialogue here, John. But Claudia gave the 10-minute sign, 8-minute sign. And I want to get your perspective on the Broadway scene today, the theater scene, the movie scene today from John Strasberg. We mentioned Waiting for Lefty earlier. Now the Public Theater recently remounted Waiting for Lefty, so they seem to be still doing work that's relevant and that's, that's political and stuff like that. But if you look around today in New York, what's your assessment? What's your critique? Good stuff, bad stuff? What's going on?
Well, there's always talent, there's always that. Unfortunately, I don't think we're in a highly creative moment. I don't go to what really defined the realistic school and defines American theater is the deeply personal nature. And this, I think theaters are defined by the playwrights that found them. Shakespeare founded, English theater. American theater, to me, is founded by Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams, who are both poets, who write, Long Day's Journey into Night is a play that could not be produced until the entire family was dead. How much more personal do you get?
Oh my
So
God.
if you want to be a successful actor in the American sense of the word, you know that you have to be that personal in your work. And while I may see good work going on, it doesn't have the deeply personal work that was taking place in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And that the younger generation has looked at what Brando and De Niro and what people were doing, but it's all done in a clever way. And it lacks the deeply personal. It lacks that,
Wow.
For whatever reason, it doesn't. One hopes that there will be a renaissance. There's talent, While we have good playwrights, we certainly don't have a Tennessee Williams. We don't have a Eugene O'Neill. David Mamet is a wonderful writer.
Right.
Sam Shepard is a good writer. John Patrick Shanley. We have really good playwrights.
Right.
But the theater is, first of all, it's so expensive.
Right.
That there is an audience that wants to go and can't. There are things I want to go see. I then start to go look at the prices and I go,
Wow.
I could probably afford it, but to pay $200 for a seat, and if you want to see Pacino now, you're going to pay $300. You're going to pay, they've got premium seats. I find it.
Insane.
I don't find it insane. I find it disgusting.
Disgusting. Yeah.
I think because it's all about the money, and there is no effort to provide to deal in a rational world. It's all about the bottom line, and the bottom line is only about the money that's coming in, not what you're actually doing. And this I find terrible. I remember I had a lot of friends who were English, and there was a period when the Royal Shakespeare came. Those years I'm talking about in the 80s, and they insisted that the Schuberts have a price tier, so that people could go, and they got what they wanted, whatever, because they insisted on it. Americans, you don't have, no American is going to insist on that. They're going to maybe try to open their own theater,
Yes.
and then you won't get any critic to come and look at it, and you can't get attention, because in New York, to try to get attention,
Yeah.
you need to have something that attracts people, and even if you do something wonderful, half the time nobody will know, and this is so you have, when the studio was at its height, whether people liked it or not, it focused everybody,
Right.
like a national theater.
Yes.
That's what it does.
Yes.
And that's as close as we have ever come.
Well,
And it focuses
yeah.
for good and for bad,
Right.
but it focuses. Now there is
Yes.
no focus, so everybody's just fighting to try to get attention, and therefore a lot of the stuff that's going on. And to be honest, I lived in Europe for 12 years. Coming back here, when I went to the theater, I went, well, God, it looks like the 1950s. It hasn't changed. Or then you go and see something that's done by a European director, in which in moments of emotion in a play by Molière,
Right.
they're squirting mustard and ketchup at one another, and in order to express emotion. And this is getting great notices.
Mm-hmm.
The guy is respected. I'm sure he's a whatever. But I just look at that and I say, yeah, sure, if I want to win awards, I could do that too. But where's the feeling?
Right.
If people aren't really moved, maybe they'll be moved in a cold intellectual way, but that's not what makes great art.
Wow. Well, we're with you on this, and one of the things that my visions or obsessions, beautiful obsessions, as you have a beautiful obsession, and your dad also did with the Actors Studio, we would like our TV show to be kind of like that National Theater or of a television show where conversation is at the center, and dialogue and humanity, and people learning how to be better actors in their own lives and better people and more humane, but also on how to talk about art better. And you are always welcome to come back on our show and to build this dream. And it's been such an honor and a pleasure to meet you, for both me and Claudia, John, and hope that this is only the beginning.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm making it all up,
Okay. That's great. That's great. So are we. That's great. Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
a lot. Yeah.